I was going to review work dealing with the combination of concepts into higher order concepts, but I decided that I was want to risk overrunning my time, so I'm going to drop all of that, and if I have time at the end, I can read a page of this. And I'm just going to talk about work dealing with the relationships between items in propositions. Frankly, I find very little success here. There are a very limited number of studies. Work by Ellman has been showcased for 15 years, and again referred to in the reviews I cited above, as providing an example of the ability for recurrent nets to extract syntactic structure. But Ellman's model deals with an extremely limited range of structures. Christensen and McDonald in 2002, is a paper that's rarely cited, they reported training of a simple recurrent network to predict the next word in a sentence. This model had a number of successful predictions. For instance, it made more errors predicting verbs of object-relative sentences than other words, but it made many false and ungrammatical predictions that were never made by humans. The most recent work on this topic, which is more than cited, it's showcased by Joannis and McClelland, is by Socher and his colleagues, I don't know how to pronounce the name, who developed a parsing model using multiple hidden layers that mediate the relationship between input and output, the so-called deep learning model. Socher used this recursive neural network to model the Stanford sentiment tree bank. The model is important because it not only assigns structure, but also interprets phrases as positive or negative in emotional valence. The model is highly successful as assigning words the proper valence, but it creates many incorrect syntactic structures that are illustrated in these two models. So for instance, in this model, he's modeling the sentence, there are slow and repetitive parts, and slow and repetitive don't share the same level of the structure. And higher up, there's a conjunct between their slow and repetitive parts, but it has just enough spice, and again, the two sentences don't share the same level of structure. So these are syntactic structures that, as far as I can see, wouldn't be endorsed by anyone who writes syntactic structures of these sentences. Now, of course, it is premature and dangerous to predict the limits of a vigorous line of research like connectionism or dynamic modeling. But I'm going to say that it seems to me that the probabilistic associative models, including all of these models, intrinsically don't have the resources that are necessary to capture concepts being related, not just associatively, but also according to the combinatorial properties that are based on their forms. They seem to be incapable of developing models of the kinds of relationships that are that produce systematicity, productivity, and compositionality, and that we see in domains such as propositional calculus. But are we stuck with these models because they're neurologically realistic, and because symbol-based procedural models have no counterpart in neurological entities? So let's turn to the last third of the talk. My reading of the literature and discussions with researchers that I've had leads me to believe that neural considerations, the belief that probabilistic associative models are neurologically realistic and symbol-based procedural models are not, are a large part of the motivation to model combinatorial operations probabilistically. In not a few papers, researchers appeal to the neurological realism of probabilistic models in adjudicating between different theories. So for instance, Seidenberg and Plaut in a discussion of models of reading aloud acknowledged that models that postulate word nodes are often provide better accounts of empirical findings in word namings than models that had distributed representations. But they endorsed the model of that included distributed representations because they considered it to be more neurologically plausible. So the neurological realism plays a very important role in the decision between different theories. So what are these neurological properties that, what are the properties of connectionist and other dynamic models that are said to be neurologically realistic? Rogers and McClelland in 2014 lists 7 what they call central tenets of connectionist models, 4 of which are widely thought to be related to or perhaps derived from neurological elements and events, and they are the following. Cognitive processes arise from real-time propagation of activation via weighted connections. Active representations are patterns of information distributed over ensembles of units. Knowledge is encoded in connection weights. Learning and long-term memory depend on changes to connection weights. In connectionist models, these 4 properties are instantiated by units at one level being connected to multiple units at other levels, and levels of activation of a unit changing the strength of the connection between it and those it connects to. So this is a pretty typical connectionist model. You have to imagine that the nodes down here, can you see the pointer, also feed back to the hidden unit nodes in this particular Boltzmann type machine. Information, knowledge, is distributed in the sense that it resides in multiple connection weights, in this case the weights in the hidden units. The pattern activity over multiple units at one level, or sometimes multiple levels, corresponds to a piece of information. The activity of individual units is not sufficient to individuate a piece of information. Learning is achieved through feedback from the difference between activated patterns in an output layer and the expected pattern, where expectations can either be provided externally, as in supervised learning, or can be internally generated by predictions about upcoming events. So I'm going to focus on neural properties of neural correlates of models which have these features. The first question is what the neurological elements that corresponds to the units themselves are. It is tempting to take them to be individual neurons for many reasons, and they're frequently represented in ways that make you think that the authors of these models think that they're individual units. So for instance, this also comes from Rogers and McClellan 2014, and that little triangle looks suspiciously like a neuron. There are many reasons to think that, there are many reasons for this possible relationship. Individual neurons have efferent and afferent connections, synapses, onto and from many other neurons. Axonal activity releases neurotransmitters that alter postsynaptic membrane voltage and induce changes in postsynaptic neurons that alter its responses to further stimulation, thereby allowing knowledge to be encoded in weights. Firing rates of neurons are related to discernible properties of input at various levels of abstraction, from oriented lines through individual faces and people, and to properties of responses. Nonetheless, units in PDP models are not likely to correspond to individual neurons. One problem with neurons being the units in connectionist models arises in connection with the postulate that active representations are patterns of activation distributed over ensembles of neurons. Because of the relationship of firing rates of neurons with properties of inputs and responses, and because in these models the activation of units relevant to responses is determined by its current input, those two properties create a problem because those properties are not found in many neurons. For instance, Hasselmo in 1995 in a fairly well-cited paper proposed a role for acetylcholine in changing the predominant influence on the dynamics of neurons in the hippocampus, in the piriform cortex, and the neocortex from recall activity that was dominated by intrinsic fiber synapses to learning activity dominated by afferent input into these areas. Wallenstein and Hasselmo demonstrated the critical importance of GABAergic neuromodulation on hippocampal population activity in sequence learning in rats. Results such as these show that informationally relevant firing rates in neurons are responsive to activity in both their afferents and in interneurons. That is, in firing rates in sets of neurons, not in individual presynaptic neurons. A second problem with neurons being the units in PDP models relates to the nature of weight changes. According to what I consider to be the implausible view that PDP units are neurons, weight changes between units are often thought of as synapses. This is an incredible oversimplification. There are multiple types of synapses in virtually all CNS cells with radically different combinations of structures responsible for postsynaptic activity. Just the distribution of inotropic and metabotropic receptors differs in huge numbers of cells. Postsynaptic cells change in multiple ways in response to their stimulation history, ranging from post-stimulation to tannic responses through development of new receptors as a result of genetic expression, a discovery that Kendall won the Nobel Prize for. Changes in postsynaptic cells occur over multiple time scales. This is a brief, short cartoon of some of the responses in postsynaptic neurons to their stimulation. I want to focus on this one element, which is a protein that is inducted by the activation of DNA, that it requires transcription and translation, and that itself leads to a cascade of phosphorylation and dephosphorylation, which alters the receptive properties of metabotropic receptors in the cells that it is in. On the other hand, there are changes that are structural changes, like the development of new synapses. In one review, it was commented that most excitatory cortical synapses occur in contacts between axonal boutons and dendritic spines, and compared with synaptic strength changes alone, that is, all of those changes that depend upon the sensitivity of receptors, changes in synaptic connectivity through de novo growth and retraction of dendritic spines and axonal boutons would hugely increase the memory storage capacity of the brain. And these authors go on to demonstrate multiple areas of the brain in which you see dynamic changes in the creation and retraction of dendritic spines. These are changes that happen over the course of hours and days. Okay. The last issue, and one that's been frequently cited in equating units in PDP models with individual neurons, pertains to feedback that underlies learning. In many PDP systems, the magnitude of the error between the output of the system and an expectation feeds back to a hidden unit layer and alters connection weights. To my knowledge, single cells that are sensitive to difference functions, for instance, dopaminergic cells in the ventral tegmental area, do not have unisynaptic reciprocal connections to their afferents. Any feedback based on error detection is determined by a complex set of responses of different cells. For instance, in the ventral tegmental area, Cohen showed that dopaminergic and GABAergic neurons are sensitive to reward in very different ways. The implication is, again, that the unit specified in PDP models must consist of sets of cells, not of individual neurons. Because of problems like these, advocates of connectionist models generally do not claim that the units that they are writing are neurons. Plout and McClellan say, quote, "The computational principles that underlie the PDP approach are intended to capture how brain areas learn to represent and process information as patterns of activity over large groups of neurons, rather than the detailed operation of individual neurons themselves." So proposals then span a range of sizes, from groups of cells that are relatively small by neural standards, such as the sets of cells that people at Georgopoulos have studied, to much larger groups of neurons. Cox, Seidenberg, and Rogers in a paper this year suggested that they may be as large as a voxel in a bold fMRI study. They said, quote, "We take the activation of a single unit to be a model analog of the mean activity of population of neighboring units similar to that estimated from changes in the bold response at a single voxel using fMRI." All of these proposals are vague and arbitrary. So for instance, though Cox et al. Pursued their suggestion with several analyses of bold signal data that they support PDP models, it seems hard to believe that they are seriously claiming that units in their models are neurons, that units are that they postulate that they have in their models are the units in a voxel in a bold signal study, if for no other reason than voxel size in functional neuroimaging studies has grown substantially smaller as technology has advanced, but as far as I know, brains have not changed in that time course. The fundamental problem with all of the proposals about larger numbers of neurons being units in PDP models is that although larger groupings of neurons have some of the properties of units in connectionist models, none of the sets of neurons that have been proposed as units in these models are known to have all of the properties attributed to units in PDP models. For instance, Georgopoulos showed that information about the direction of movement was coded as a population vector over a set of 241 neurons, but there was no evidence that groups of neurons of about that size have features that correspond to weight changes in PDP models or have reciprocal connections to neurons that encode error signals. So I've directed my comments so far towards the lack of correspondence between units in PDP models and elements of the brain, but the problem arises the other way around. There are informationally relevant physiological events that are not clearly related to, clearly not modeled in connectionist models. For instance, theta phase precession, the time a neuron fires relevant to the phase of theta rhythm oscillations in the local field potential, is exhibited by spatial cells in the rat entorhinal hippocampal circuit and reduces uncertainty about the position of an animal. So is information relevant? But it's not clear how this would be modeled in connectionist approaches. The problem of what elements in the brain correspond to units in PDP models is only one problem that PDP models have in connecting with neurology. Plout and McClellan say, quote, "There are clearly many aspects of the standard PDP framework that do not emulate known aspects of neurophysiology." And they go on to list a few, which I'll skip for reasons of time. Has been repeatedly emphasized, PDP models are generally not intended to emulate all aspects of the underlying neural substrate. At times, these problems affect the claims that advocates of PDP models make. So for instance, Plout and McClellan go on to say, I think this quote's extremely interesting, quote, "Neural verisimilitude per se has not been our primary goal. Rather, the approach is directed first and foremost at accounting for performance on cognitive tasks as it occurs in real time, how performance changes over the course of abnormal and normal development and in adulthood, and as well as addressing individuals and the consequences of brain damage." That is, the approach was supposed to be justified by its psychological predictions. But these old habits die hard. On the very next page of their paper, Plout and McClellan appeal to neurological plausibility in arguing about connections and symbolic solutions to the type-token relation. And I'll skip the quote again for reasons of time. But I'm not going to skip the following because I love it. Advocates of PDP models clearly believe deeply in their neurological realism. So at one point, Rogers and McClelland in their 2014 paper say, quote, "The brain contains 10 to 100 billion neuron-like processing units." I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. On one reading, this is reification on steroids. As far as I know, the brain doesn't contain neuron-like processing units. It contains neurons. It's the model that contains processing units. Whether they are neuron-like, and whether more broadly the ensemble of features of these models corresponds to neural structures and neurophysiological features, are open questions. Okay, last part. Symbolic models. The belief that PDP models are neurologically realistic is often associated with the belief that symbol-based procedural models are not. What is said to make them unrealistic is that they postulate discrete categories and rules which it is claimed cannot be related to neural elements. So let me talk about these briefly. The argument that discrete categories are incompatible with neurology is linked to the view that neural systems encode knowledge as connection weights and activated information as distributed patterns of activity. The contrast is between distributed and localist representations. In distributed models, quote, a concept is represented by a pattern of activity over a collection of neurons. That is, more than one neuron is required to represent a concept. Each neuron participates in the representation of more than one concept. In localist models, each neuron represents a single concept on a standalone basis. The critical distinction is that localist units have meaning and interpretation, whereas distributed representations don't. The strongest instantiation of localist representations would be single cells, often called grandmother cells, a term that was used first derisively by Jerry Lettvin and then popularized by Barlow. The term grandmother cell refers to a neuron that, quote, would respond only to a specific, complex, and meaningful stimulus, that is, to a single percept or even a single concept, from Gross 2002. Barlow says, quote, the concept included invariance of response for changes in some variables, as well as selectivity of response for others, together with the idea that these cells are created by processing at a hierarchy of levels, unquote. There are many examples of single-cell localist coding in the central nervous system. The first that I ever came across was as a graduate student, and they were the type 2 neurons in the frog's retina described by Levin, Maturin, and his colleagues, which responded to stimuli with the characteristics of small moving bugs. Many more examples of single neurons that respond to biologically salient events or code for complex motor actions are given in very interesting review papers by Bowers in Psych Review in 2009, 2010, and a couple in 2010. Localist representations have been documented at very high neurological levels. Page in Psych Review 2000, Bowers 2009, and Roy in Frontiers of Psychology 2012 and 2013 review all kinds of results. Striking and much discussed examples are the cells reported by Qian Quiroga in 2009 that respond selectively to faces of individuals presented from a variety of angles and with a variety of features. For instance, one cell in medial temporal lobe responded to pictures of the actress Halle Berry, even when she was presented as Catwoman, one of her roles. Some of these cells respond to both pictures and names. For instance, Qian Quiroga found separate cells that responded to both pictures of the actress Jennifer Aniston and the Iraqi president Saddam Hussein, and to their names. Cells with localist properties are often modeled as the terminals of hierarchies of cells that respond to increasingly more complex sets of features, with categorized entities at the top of the hierarchy. Hierarchical organizations of neural responsiveness were first reported by Hubel and Wiesel in their responses on cells in V1 to V3. Poggio and Bisi in 2004 present models that contain cells with broad tuning for elementary features and narrow receptive fields that project to cells with broader receptive fields that respond to combinations of features, and then to cells with even larger receptive fields that respond to shapes in a viewpoint invariant way after learning. So for instance, here's an example from one of Poggio's works of a cell that responds into complex changes of shape, size, and rotation. So here's its response to changes in size of that pattern, and here's its set of responses to its changes in rotation. And here's an example of, here's Poggio and Bisi's modeling of the representation of categories in a hierarchically organized set of cells, the ones at the top of the hierarchy responding to categorized entities. So several issues have led to confusion about localist and distributed representations, and I'm going to just mention two. One is that information about complex stimuli may be encoded locally at higher levels of the nervous system, but be distributed at lower levels. For instance, information about distal visual stimuli that trigger recognition of a face would be distributed over retinal neurons. Bowers has in 2009, has very insightful commentary on this, and he points out that the information at the retina is necessary but not sufficient to recognize a face. The information that the distal object is a face and whose face it is not present at the retina. Localist models apply to the representation of this latter type of information. A second point of information is that many neurons that selectively respond above a threshold also respond to some degree to other stimuli. That is, their tuning curves are relatively broad. And Bowers again points out that there is a difference between what a neuron responds to and what it encodes. Unless the subthreshold activity of a neuron is required to recognize a second item, the representation is localist. Localist neurons have also been argued to have several limitations. For instance, the ability to represent both instances and categories, that is, to deal with the type-token relation. Bowers describes, and Poggio and Beatzik describe several possible solutions to this problem, which, as far as I can see, arises in distributed models as well. Now, turning to the last item, the neural basis of combinatorial properties in symbolic systems. To my knowledge, no studies have addressed the question of what the physiological correlates of formal combinatorial rules might be. 5 minutes? I'm sure I'll be done. I'm just going to suggest that there might be some aspects of some phase dynamic models that might correspond to these features of symbol-based models. So dynamic models describe sequences of activation of categories as transitions between attractors in phase or state space. And dynamic models allow for the effects of a priori values to affect these transitions. And some of these a priori values may be hardwired. So this could be the basis for species and domain-specific rules that create syntactic structure, underlie valid inference, and others. I'll conclude this section and really the whole talk with a quotation from Plout and McClelland. They say, "The PDP approach for us is grounded in the belief that certain computational principles of neural systems are fundamental to explaining human cognitive performance." I think that there is room to be skeptical about the extent to which real neural data inform psychological models, both on theoretical grounds and in actual practice. On theoretical grounds, functionalism holds that neural events are not psychologically causal. In practice, we need to ask which computational principles of neural systems are, quote, fundamental to explaining human cognitive performance. Distributed representations, backpropagation and unsupervised learning, or feed-forward processing to localist neurons that encode combinations of features from lower levels as categories. So to conclude, overall, as best I can see, symbol-based procedural models and what I've called probabilistic associative models are equally neurally realistic or unrealistic. Probabilistic associative models have much better spin in this regard, having commandeered terms like neural net, but that is more likely to be madmen than scientists at work. In rare but revealing moments, such as the quotation from Plout and MacDonald that I cited above, advocates admit as much. The choice between models of these different types depends on the extent to which they can account for psychological phenomena, just as the choice of different models within each class does. To a first approximation, the successes of these approaches can be seen as having a complementary distribution, with symbol-based rule models having success at describing and to some extent explaining combinatorial operations, and probabilistic association models having more success in describing and to some extent explaining real-time activation of individual items, especially in quasi-regular domains and the interactions of information from multiple domains in item processing. As far as I can see, there is no reason in principle or derived from currently available neurological data why both types of models might not be correct. Thank you.
thank you. This was very, very interesting. Back to Chomsky's quote. I mean, it's hard for me, and okay, it's hard for me not to agree with him. I mean, I'm just wondering where you're putting yourself. So you're asking Jill yesterday a question, and about when she was saying, what do you think? What was it? Movement to spec CP is a real thing and so forth. But let's take something I think was mentioned yesterday morning, called C-command. So C-command seems to be a description within a theory with a specific kind, but it seems to be like, I think Chomsky would probably say, there's something that we need that in order to explain so many phenomena, including, I mean, there's a lot, I think one more, I was just reading yesterday a paper about agreement or lack of errors in reflexives that are really sensitive to C-command. And so it's not just theoretical linguistics. I think we have a lot of evidence from psycholinguistics for the relevance of this notion. And as you said at the end, it's not clear to me at all what would be the neural representation of C-command, definitely not in associative system. And I do think this is a challenge for neuroscience, the right kind of challenge. I mean, that neuroscience needs to take this mess of connections and find out how C-command is there, not either way around, not say, oh, we don't know how C-command will be in the brain, and we must give up this concept in linguistics and try to reduce anything we know about C-command to some known properties of neurons. This just to me to be really wrong, a way of doing, really unfortunate direction for the science to go. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, I agree with that, but I think whether you feel that that's a position that needs to be defended kind of depends upon how often you come in contact with people who attack it. Is this? Yeah. So I have the feeling that most of the people in this room don't rub shoulders on a day-to-day basis with either connectionist modelers or people who do one or another type of basic neuroscience work. But I do, and I can tell you that there's just as you have a predisposition, or at this point, to accept abstract concepts like C-command or entailment. People who work at the level of neurons and molecular biology are deeply distrustful of that level of abstraction. The connectionists, I think, and people like Spivey and people who do dynamic phase and dynamic state modeling, appeal to neurological researchers because they say we can account for some phenomena that rule-based approaches have explained better than the people who developed the rule-based approaches can. So in English, there's been a debate about past tense formation, and in multiple languages, there has been debate about reading and whether or not rule-based models or models that don't postulate rules and basically postulate massive associationist nets do a better job. If you believe that the association approaches, the connectionist models or the dynamic phase, dynamic state models do a better job, and you think that they have some neurological plausibility, then you might tend to think, well, just give them time in bigger machines, and eventually they will be able to account for the phenomena that are now accounted for by rules in these kinds of models that don't actually have rules or unitary symbol-based models. So I do think that that's a mistake. I think that you have to look at the range of psychological phenomena that each of these theories account for. And I've tried, I know I went through a lot of material here, I tried to give my views about where I think connectionist models have been successful. I'm not even sure that in those areas that they outperform symbol-based models all the time, although there's some examples where they probably do, at least I'm willing to grant that. There are whole domains in which they don't, I think. Then the sort of question about where you think science is going to go is whether you think that it's likely that they will. So, I mean, I have been hearing for 30 years, roughly since 1986, that the ability to model syntactic relations is just around the corner, and it's still just around the corner. But I mean, there have been some improvements. The deep learning models do a better job of extracting syntactic structure and interpreting it than any models that have come before. They still have a ways to go. Connectionists, McClelland would no doubt say that that representation of a tree structure in Saussures' work is good enough. And who's to say whether it's the wrong representation and the representation that a minimalist or Jackendorf or a GPSG grammarian writes is correct. That representation is good enough to assign semantic valences to words, and that's the name of the game, is to interpret the structure. Now, this is, this is a matter of predicting where science is going to go and what the outcome of different lines of research are going to be, and I think it's I don't think that that's a very productive kind of discussion. What I was trying to do here is argue that the claim that one of these approaches has to be right because it's neurologically realistic, which I think is part of its appeal, is greatly overstated.
Anyone else? All right, coffee break then.
Break.
Thank you.